It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. Now let's get right to our guest, David Cay Johnston. Mr. Johnston, are you there?
Yes, it's Johnston with a T.
Johnston, I'm sorry.
Okay.
And he's the author of the book, The Making of Donald Trump. And if you look for this book, you can find it on the Opperman Report bookstore, and you can also find it on the blog. And if you're looking on Amazon, it's David Cay. His middle name is Cay, C-A-Y. It's not the letter K. It's David Cay Johnston. And you can find that there on Amazon.com. Mr. Johnston, I know you're a Pulitzer Prize winner. I think right now you're in the top 10 bestsellers list for this book, The Making of Donald Trump. Worked for the New York Times, and now I follow all your stuff on the Daily Beast. I follow you on Facebook. But tell us about yourself. Who's David Cay Johnston, the personal guy?
Well, thank you, Ed. Just call me David. I have been an investigative reporter since I was a teenager. When I was 18 years old, the San Jose Mercury recruited me to be a reporter. They hired me at 19, and within weeks I was on their front page. And over the next 40 years, I worked for the San Jose Mercury, the Detroit Free Press, the Los Angeles Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the New York Times. And since 2008, when I left the New York Times, I've worked for myself for various places, and I teach in law school and the business school at Syracuse University. Right.
You're a law professor at Syracuse University as well. Now, you've been researching and writing about Donald Trump for 30 years.
Off and on, yeah.
So you got it. You're probably like the go-to expert on Donald Trump. I see on MSNBC all the time.
Yeah.
Okay.
I probably have. In fact, I'm sure that I have the largest private collection of Trump documents. I have tens of thousands of pages of stuff I've collected over the years on Donald, because I've tracked him, because he's an important force in America to understand America.
Absolutely. Now, did you ever think he would get this far? I know you thought that he was going to run for president one time, because he did run for the Reform Party and some kind of stuff like that. But did you ever think he would get this far?
Well, when he announced this time, back in June of 2015, I was the only national journalist who said he might get the nomination. By the fall, somewhere August or September a year ago, I started saying that it looked like he might well get the nomination, because there were so many candidates, and he was essentially picking them off one at a time. And if you go back and listen to the television series The West Wing, there are some astonishing parallels to this, where the fictional president Jed Bartlett says, I wasn't supposed to win. I was just supposed to try and push Hoynes a little bit, the other candidate, the presumed nominee, to the left or the center, and it happened. And I saw the same sort of thing in what Donald was up to, that he was one by one picking off people.
Yeah, I tell you, I've been watching this too, and I've never seen anything like this in my life. I'm 53 years old. What do you? Before we get into the whole, I want to get into start with his grandfather, then the father, and move into present time as much as we can fit in.
Sure.
But before we get to that, what do you think of this conspiracy theory that he was put in there by the Clintons to throw the race?
Absolutely. I think that's just nonsense. Donald has talked about being president since 1985. He asked George H.W. Bush to make him his vice president. He ran in 2000. He's run briefly before. Donald believes that he should be president. And what the Clintons were thrilled about is that he was, in their view, the candidate who was the easiest to defeat in a general election. And events are at the moment suggesting that they may be right about that, although 80-plus days is a long time, and a lot can happen between now and November.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us about Trump's grandfather.
Well, Donald Trump's grandfather, Friedrich, in 1885 turned 16 years old, and that meant, as a citizen of Germany, that he had to go into the military. So, like many young men in Germany, he left home in the middle of the night and came to America to evade the draft. He then followed Horace Greeley's advice, go west, young man, and he went first to Seattle, then to Everett, Washington, and then to the Yukon Territory, where he ran whorehouses, and he made a lot of money. He built a hotel in one case on land he didn't own, not a hotel for sleeping, but more active activities. And he then went home to Germany. His mother showed him off as this rich young man to all these women in the little town of Kallstadt, which is in the Rhine Valley winemaking area. And he chose a woman Mom didn't approve of. They went back to America. They went to America. They had a daughter. His wife hated America, wanted to go back, so he returned to Germany. And the Germans said, "You're a draft dodger. Get out and leave the country." So he came back to America, and then he died in the 1918 influenza pandemic. So Donald never knew his grandfather.
And his grandfather ran a whorehouse. Unbelievable.
Bunch of them.
A string of them. Wow, you can't be undone if you're a Trump. Okay, now what about the father? Now, I've been watching all your stuff, and I'm a big fan of your work, trust me, okay? And so is the audience. And I've been preparing for this interview, all your different interviews and some of your speeches that are on YouTube. But you never mentioned Trump's dad being part of the KKK.
Oh, no, I have done that many times, and it's in the book.
Okay.
In 1927, in Queens, New York, in the Jamaica section, there was a pitched battle between about 1,000 KKK members, some of them hooded and in robes, and their supporters, and about 100 New York police. And among those arrested was Fred Trump. Now, Donald Trump told the New York Times last year that never happened. It didn't happen. And you know, even if there's some record, but it wasn't him. He didn't live at that address. There were no charges filed. So because there were no charges filed, you should never write about this. Well, the address that was reported in all 8 New York City newspapers that I've looked at the time was the address that Fred Trump lived at, and you can look it up in various public records. Most of those arrested, once they had been arrested and identified, were not pursued. And that's very common. We do this in law enforcement all the time. People get arrested and then we don't pursue the charges. And the fact that there were no charges filed is irrelevant to the historical fact that Donald's father was one of those people arrested during this demonstration by the police. And there's no question that he was arrested because he was with the KKK people. Fred Trump has a long, well-documented history, including findings by administrative bodies and a trial before a federal judge that they settled of discriminating against blacks and Puerto Ricans. And in my book, The Making of Donald Trump, I quote a Woody Guthrie song. Woody Guthrie, the folk singer, lived in Beach Haven, which was a Fred Trump housing project built after World War II, and his song is about how Fred Trump wouldn't let anybody in who wasn't white and acceptable to him as white.
Yeah, what are the odds of that Woody Guthrie would write a song about the presidential candidate's father being a racist? You know? And also, too, if you look at the New York Times, because that little clip is online, that article is online, and you could read.
Well, it wasn't just the New York Times. I mean, the Brooklyn Eagle reported it. Other newspapers reported it in New York. And so this was very well established at the time.
And if you read the flyer that they were handing out, it's the same tone as Trump's announcement when he was going to run for president about Mexicans being rapists. Same tone. Yes,
and let me tell you one of the oddities about that, Ed. I watched live when Donald announced. He comes down the escalator to the lobby of Trump Tower with his wife Melania in front of him. And there are all these young people around, you know, well-dressed, kind of young people you'd expect to see in Midtown Manhattan who are overwhelmingly white and appear to have, you know, college educations from their dress and their demeanor. And Donald delivers this speech about Mexicans as murderers and rapists, and he gets applause. And then Muslims, he attacks them, and he gets applause. Now, Midtown Manhattan is not known as a center of racist and xenophobia activity. So when I looked at this, I said, this is really odd. And my assumption at the time was, well, they must have bussed these kids in from some young people from somewhere else. A day or two later, the Hollywood Reporter broke the story that they were actors paid $50 each. And we're told, you know, show up, applaud when you get the signal to applaud, and you get $50. And, you know, out-of-work actors, in addition to waiting on tables, will do just about any kind of work to pick up $50.
Yeah, oh no, sure. That's a pretty good gig, and also too, he's
you mean it lasted less than an hour for $50?
Yeah, and he's
young actors showed up in droves,
and he's used to doing that for The Apprentice.
But it also tells you that Donald launched his campaign with a fraud, and this didn't surprise me once that came out, because Donald's entire life he has been a con artist, and he has orchestrated frauds. And in the Making of Donald Trump, I go through many of these to show what he did.
I was thinking it might be fun for the rest of this interview if we referred to him as Mr. Trump.
Okay, that's fine. My publisher actually prefers that, and I keep saying, but I know him. We've had lunch, we've had dinner, but sure, we'll call him Mr. Trump.
Just like on Gilligan's Island, they called him Mr. Howell because he was rich.
Right.
You got to call him Mr. Trump. Now, his dad was a big shot in New York. He was friends with Mayor Abe Beame from high school.
Yeah, Abe Beame, who became mayor in the 70s, was a lifelong, very close friend of Fred Trump. Fred understood how to work the political process to get what he wanted. He understood how to spread donations around. He was very involved with what's called the Brooklyn Democratic Club. And when Donald wanted to move from the outer boroughs where his father was, primarily, overwhelmingly Queens, to Manhattan, his first big project was taking just this rundown old hotel called the Commodore at Grand Central Station, stripping it down to the skeleton and rebuilding it as a Grand Hyatt hotel. All borrowed money, enormous subsidies. In fact, the subsidies Donald got from the city of New York, the first ever for a hotel, were roughly 3.5 times the money that was spent to build the new hotel. Donald is one of the biggest welfare kings in America, and there's a documentary that was made about Donald. You can get it at iTunes and some other places online, called Donald Trump the Movie, or Trump the Movie. And in it, one of the top aides to Abe Beame says, Mayor Beame said, whatever Mr. Trump wants, he gets. And so the taxpayers provided Donald with this enormous subsidy, roughly $400 million for a less than $100 million hotel, which is a pretty good trick.
Yeah, we actually had Libby on the show. I'm obsessed with Trump. I can't get enough of his character. I'm from New York.
Well, she did a fabulous job. That movie back then was shown exactly twice because of Donald's threats of litigation. And Donald has suppressed many articles. That movie, I am sitting right now in the garden of my home in Rochester, New York, which was paid for work I did for Tim Burton, the movie director, Edward Scissorhands, Alice in Wonderland. He wanted to do a movie about Trump, and Trump killed it with threats of litigation. But I got enough money that I have a nice garden now.
If you need a room, if you need a Cato Kalin to move in with you, let me know. Okay, now for people who say that Trump's a political outsider, what do you say to that?
Oh, that's nonsense. I mean, he hasn't been an office holder. He's never done any public service of any kind in his life, none. But he has been, by his own account, buying and selling politicians throughout his whole life, or at least renting them. I would argue he rents them. He knows how to spread money around. If you're a politician, there are two ways money works. One is you get money from people who are your friends. The much more troubling one, and Donald knows very well how to do this, is you don't want to play ball, or at least not get in my way. I will fund someone to replace you. And Donald's very good at that. And in the W. Handros movie, he's caught on tape bragging about how, he is influencing politics with his money. And, of course, every politician will tell you that, I get their money because they like me, but it doesn't influence my votes. Yeah, right. And I don't have a beard.
Yeah. Now, what about Trump's dad? Because he made his money through HUD grants, right? He was called a profiteer.
Yes. Well, now, Fred Trump was a really industrious guy. He's different than Donald in that. Donald is not a particularly hard worker. But Fred, 2 years after his father died, when he was only 15 years old, started a business building garages in Queens. The business was owned by his mother, so it was called Elizabeth Christ and Son. And Then he moved up in his 20s into building houses. Then the economy fell apart with the stock market collapse in 1929, and he opened one of the first modern grocery stores. Historically, you went to a store with a list, and clerks went and got the things off the shelf. He opened one up where you got the stuff, as we do now, off the shelf, and he sold it after about a year for a very nice little profit. Then during the war, he got contracts to build housing for shipyard workers in Virginia and Pennsylvania. That taught him how the government contracting system worked, and Fred Trump is said to be the first person in line at the Federal Housing Administration after World War II ended to get loans to put up housing in the outer boroughs of New York, overwhelmingly in Queens. Well, he was efficient. He also built cheap buildings. They weren't quality buildings, and he skimped on things. And some officials at the FHA figured out some of the developers, of whom Fred Trump was the most prominent, were gaming the rules to make much bigger profits than they were supposed to make on these government contracts. They brought this to President Eisenhower, who apparently threw a fit in the Oval Office over this, and all of a sudden, the evidence that he certainly was not happy is that within days there were 100 federal investigators working on the case. The Senate Banking Committee then held hearings, and Fred Trump was called to testify under oath, and he said, and this is sort of a precursor of Donald in the way Donald talks about, Mr. Trump, in the way Mr. Trump, Donald talks about money. He said, this is all a misunderstanding. Yes, there's $4 million extra here, but I'm not a profiteer. I didn't put that money in my pocket. It's sitting in my bank account. I don't know about you, but I don't care if my money's in my pocket or my bank account. It's still the money I've got.
Yeah, if you've got my money in your account, I still don't have it.
That's right. And it was an early indication of how his son would come up with these creative arguments about what he was up to.
Speaking of creative arguments, what do you make of this claim by Donald Trump where he says, I'm a self-made guy, I borrowed $1 million, a small loan, $1 million, and I paid it right back with interest? Well,
that's like when Ross Perot says that he started EDS Systems with a $1,000 loan from his wife. It may be technically true, but it has nothing to do with the overall reality. When Donald Trump was in diapers, the trust fund his father created for him each year received roughly 4 times the average income of American families. So this kid's in diapers, and he's got 4 times the average income flowing into his trust fund. Through Dad, he had access to bank loans, to bankers, to Abe Bean to get things cleared through the city of New York. And his father, by the way, had to repeatedly bail him out. Donald had said publicly, I never got any money borrowed from my father's estate. When he was under oath, he said, really wasn't nothing, almost nothing. Well, how much was it? Well, it was nothing. Nothing, almost nothing. How much exactly, Mr. Trump? Well, $9 million. So.
Yeah, that's in a deposition. Then later on, he says there was another small loan, an equally small loan, I guess another $9 million. Now, what about?
Yeah, what about? Donald. If you have no track record and no background, and you've been saving your money to go into a business, and you go to a bank, you're not in the same shoes as Donald Trump was, where his father was reportedly the biggest depositor Chase Bank had in the outer boroughs of Manhattan. And he would go in and ask for a loan, and, surprise, surprise, the bankers would be, yes, sir, and how much would you like? And let us give you our best rate, and we'll give you a discount off that.
Hey, what about the dad's estate? Whatever happened to that money? Do we know?
Yes, and that's one of the most important stories about understanding Donald. There were 5 Trump children. Right. The oldest was Fred Trump Jr. Fred Trump Jr. was not really interested in the family business. He became a pilot for TWA, and he also became an alcoholic, and he died in his 40s. When Fred Trump died in 1999, his will was read, and that line of the family discovered that for all practical purposes they were cut out of the will. Instead of collecting many tens of millions of dollars, the 2 grandchildren each got $200,000. I know you're going to be shocked, Ed, to hear that they went and got a lawyer and went to court and accused the 4 surviving siblings of using undue influence on Dad to cut them out of the will. All Trump family members get health care through the Trump company. Lots of family companies do this. They provide extended members of the family with first-class health care, and Donald is a big believer in universal health care. He thinks that's a responsibility of government, and we should all have first-rate health care. Not exactly a Republican Party position. Well, a few days after the death of Fred Trump, a new grandnephew was born. That is, the late Fred Trump's son, Freddie Jr., had a baby. And this little boy began having seizures within 48 hours of his birth. He stopped breathing twice. The Trump family was covering every medical expense of any kind the family had, and his bills for the first year ran around $300,000. When that line of the family sued, Donald cut off the health care. And Donald was asked by Heidi Evans, the New York Daily News, an excellent reporter whom I know, you put a child's life in jeopardy. And Donald said, well, I don't like people who sue my father's estate. And Heidi says, well, do you think, Donald, people might think you were being cold-hearted? And he says, what else could I do? And in effect, what he did was, by slicing the pie 4 ways instead of 5, he made more money. And he was willing, out of anger, to put the life of a sickly child in jeopardy. Now, let me contrast that with something Donald did 5 years before that. Donald's personal helicopter, called at the time the Ivana, for his first wife, and the fleet of helicopters used by his Atlantic City casinos were obtained from a company owned by a mob associate and convicted felon named Joseph Wexelbaum. There are lots of helicopter companies he could have gone to, well-financed companies, well-managed companies. He went to these guys. Joseph Wexelbaum was indicted as a major cocaine and marijuana trafficker. According to the indictment, he personally handled the drugs. He ran the operation directly. And the drug smuggling went from Miami to Cincinnati, Ohio. So Joey Wexelbaum agreed to plead guilty. He asked that his case, in a letter I cite in The Making of Donald Trump, be moved either to Miami, where the case, the drug smuggling began, or to New York City, where he lived. Instead, mysteriously, and nobody, the defense lawyer, the prosecutor, nobody can explain this, it ended up in New Jersey, and it came before a federal judge named Marianne Trump Berry, who is Mr. Trump's older sister. Now, Judge Marianne Trump Berry removed herself from the case. The legal term is recusal. But think about the conversation that had to take place, Ed. She walks down to the hall to the chief federal judge and says, listen, I can't handle this case because this major drug trafficker, my husband flies in his helicopters every week because he is a lawyer for the Trump casinos. I fly in this guy's helicopters all the time. We have a federal judge flying around in the helicopters of a drug trafficker. Donald then writes a letter pleading for mercy for this guy. Now, remember, he cut off health care for a sickly infant who's his grandnephew. He says he's a stand-up guy and a diligent, good citizen, and he shouldn't get much time. Well, the little fish, just the people who drove the drugs up to Ohio, they got up to 20 years. This guy spent 18 months in the clink, and when he came out, said he was broke. He couldn't pay the penalties he had, but he moved into a multi-million-dollar apartment in Trump Tower.
Now, I've heard you say that the circumstances around him getting that apartment were suspicious or irregular. Can you describe that in depth a little bit more?
Well, it's totally unclear how the woman, the girlfriend of Joey Wexelbaum, qualified for the mortgage. And there were several people who had mortgages in that building who were women associated with corrupt union leaders or mob guys who got loans without going through the normal underwriting process, where you demonstrate you have the income to take care of the loan. But I think the most interesting part of this is beyond the total contrast between the sickly relative who doesn't care about, and this guy, is Donald had a casino license. And under the law in New Jersey, if you're a casino owner, you had a legal obligation to prove by clear and convincing evidence that you were honest, that you were trustworthy, that you were morally fit, and that you did not associate with criminals. Donald writes a letter on behalf of this guy. He tried to cover it up. He finally admitted he had done it. And he continues to do business with this guy. Now, here's the question. I don't know the answer to it, but I know the question. What motivated Donald Trump to risk his incredibly lucrative casino licenses for this drug trafficker? What was it that put this guy in a position that Donald needed him to be his friend and not his enemy? And we don't know, but clearly something was going on that Donald desperately did not want this man to be his enemy.
So one possibility would, this guy could make a deal and say, listen, I'll tell you who's been funding my drug deals. And possibly that could be Donald Trump.
The most obvious possibility would be Donald does not use drugs and doesn't drink. But the most obvious possibility would be that Donald was somehow financing the drug deals. That's exactly right. And I don't know if that happened or not, but the circumstances just scream that something was wrong. What Trump had going for him, though, Ed, was this. He got his casino license after a truncated investigation. It was not complete. It missed 4 different federal grand jury investigations of Trump. He didn't reveal these, so on those grounds alone, he should have been denied a casino license. But once he got a license and the Division of Gaming Enforcement recommended him, the only person ever recommended for a license, everybody else was either opposed or the Division of Gaming Enforcement was neutral. When anything raised a question about his fitness, the Division of Gaming Enforcement tread very carefully. They never asked him a question or undertook an investigation that would force them to recommend withdrawal of his license. 2 casino commissioners accused the Division of Gaming Enforcement, which is part of the New Jersey Attorney General's office, of official favoritism to Donald Trump. Publicly accused him of this in a formal proceeding in 1990. And essentially, once the Division of Gaming Enforcement's errors and mistakes had come to light, the bureaucratic imperative to deny reality and protect their own bureaucratic reputation took hold.
Very interesting. Let me ask you a question.
And by the way, I wrote that part of the story in my first book in 1992 called Temples of Chance, which was about how these corporations got into the casino business, and in which I predicted, as we've actually seen happen, the spread of casinos all across America.
I want to jump back to the helicopter company for a second, because one motivation would be that, hey, possibly, there was some shenanigans going on with the drug dealing.
That's one.
And when you consider, too, Trump's friendship with Adnan Khashoggi, that's not unreasonable. What do you know about Trump?
That's right, and it could well be that Donald didn't do anything, but he had friends who had done things, and he was very close with the Saudi arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi, and they partied together, they traveled around together, they were seen with all sorts of sporting women, as the saying goes. Yeah. And it may well be that Khashoggi or somebody else had done something. But clearly, the one thing we know with an absolute certainty is it was so important that Donald go to bat for this guy that he was willing to risk his casino license for it.
Okay, another possibility that I've never heard you talk about is right now Trump has a lawsuit in New York City, federal court. These 13-year-old, well, they're adults now, but these young women are claiming they were raped by Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. Yeah. And Jeffrey Epstein, who was a convicted pedophile, a longtime friend of Trump's, a neighbor in Palm Beach. Many of his victims worked for Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Now, his pilots had a lot to say about him.
Yeah. Now, and Ed, this is the one area of Trump's life that I don't go into in the book, and I haven't spent any time with. And the reason is that I knew about Marla Maples 9 months before she became public. I didn't write about it. Billionaire Has Girlfriend to me is the news the same way that airplane takes off in San Francisco and lands in New York City is not news. So I don't know anything about the Jeffrey Epstein case. Other people have written about it, and people should read about it because it's very disturbing. But I don't know anything about it, and I haven't written about it, and I haven't investigated it.
Okay, great. Now, by the way, I got a funny Marla Maples story, too, I could say, but we don't have time. Now, I was going to ask you about his Mr. Trump's ties Okay, but not his ties that he buys in China, but his mob ties. Okay,
Yeah.
Right. Now, besides this helicopter guy, and what else? What are the mob ties?
Well, in the construction business in New York, you had a number of unions, the Teamsters and some others, who were under the control of the Genovese and Gambino organized crime families. Here's how Mr. Trump is different than the other developers in New York. First of all, Fred Trump, his father, had a business partner, Willie Tomasello. And Willie Tomasello was identified in the reports of the New York State Organized Crime Task Force and other law enforcement documents as a front for the Gambino and Genovese organized crime families. So Donald Trump's father had a business partner representing the two biggest mob families in New York. Second, Donald, Mr. Trump, as you prefer, when he arrived in New York, made a beeline to make friends with the notorious Roy Cohn, who was the attack dog for Senator Joseph McCarthy. And among Roy Cohn's clients were the heads of the Gambino and Genovese crime families. Trump Tower is a concrete building. It is made with ready-mix concrete. It is not a steel girder building. Now, the steel workers are an honest union, but the cement union, the Teamsters, the demolition union, the carpenters, the cement workers, all of those were under the thumb of the mafia. The other major developers in New York, notably the Lafrac and Resnick families, had gone to Rudy Giuliani and the FBI and said, please free us of these mob guys. And eventually they were freed by them, and these guys all went to prison. Donald embraced these guys. And because of his relationship with Roy Cohn, when there was a concrete strike during the period when Trump Tower was being built, and it's ready-mix concrete, so you can't have labor trouble or your project will get all screwed up, every project with cement in New York was shut down except one, Trump Tower. So Donald embraced these guys when everybody else was pleading with the government to get them off their backs.
It's interesting, too, you mentioned Roy Cohn, because he had this theory that he could deduct all of his personal living expenses because his whole life was part of his business, and he wound up not paying any tax. That was a very creative...
And Roy Cohn was always paid in cash, and he boasted about the fact that he was under indictment for almost two-thirds of his adult life. Donald wrote about Roy Cohn, not Cohn,
right,
and said he regarded him as his mentor, as a second father, and then I think most famously and significantly he said the thing he loved about Roy Cohn was Roy would brutalize for you. And that's part of Donald's fundamental approach to life. He wants people who will brutalize for him, anybody who gets in his way, he will destroy them.
Back to Atlantic City for a second. He was in a very public feud with Merv Griffin. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Merv Griffin was a very smart, very wealthy businessman. And the public image you saw, this nice, folksy guy, was his public persona, was a character he played. He was, in fact, a very, very astute businessman who was worth some hundreds of millions of dollars. And Merv had gotten his first big break in Atlantic City, and he'd gotten it at the old Resorts Hotel, so he wanted to buy resorts. Now, the smart move would have been to buy the assets of the company, but he bought the company. And Donald also wanted the company because, in addition to the old Resorts Hotel, next to it was what became the Trump Taj Mahal, which was, at the time it was built, by far the biggest casino in Atlantic City. It was about twice the size of Trump Plaza and Trump Castle, or equal to the two of them together. And Mr. Trump coveted this property because he wanted to have the biggest and the best, and he did things he normally does, like he told you it was, I forget how many stories high, but that's because you went from floor 1 to floor 2 to floor 13. And he added 12. He added the in between 10 floors at the top. And he'd done this in other buildings. And during this fight, what happened is they agreed to split up the assets. Then both of them used 100% borrowed money. So Mr. Trump never had a single dollar invested in Atlantic City. All three of the casinos, plus for a while a fourth one, were obtained with borrowed money, and he always had a negative investment in it. And normally business owners have their own skin in the game, and they have an interest in building the enterprise so that over time they get wealthier and wealthier. Mr. Trump's sole interest was sucking money out of these properties as fast as he could. So while others were investing in ways to improve customer service, to bind customers to them, to continually upgrade the quality of the rooms and things like that, the Trump properties were stripped just as fast as they could of every dollar they could figure out how to take out of them.
Yeah, I remember there was a beautiful restaurant called Ivana's.
Yeah.
It was gorgeous when it first opened up, and then I went back a couple of years later, 3 years later, and it was a dump.
Yeah, because they didn't put any money into maintaining it. Donald does not build businesses. He has a great business skill at identifying something that will, at no cost to him, bring him cash. If you go to Mr. Trump tomorrow and say, hey, listen, I want to finance, as is being discussed now in the press, a new television network. Fox is in decline. Its viewership is old. I want to start a whole new alternative cable television network. You don't have to put up a penny, and we will guarantee you X million dollars a year just for the use of your name. He'd sign up right away, but he would also figure out how to make sure that he got the maximum possible amount of cash out of it, no matter whether the business succeeds or fails.
Real quick, before you published The Making of Donald Trump, did anybody come to you, one of these other candidates, and try and hire you for opposition research?
Oh, no, and I would never talk to anybody like that. I work on my own. I have always worked on my own. I even do my own math. I mean, when I would do stories in the New York Times, slicing and dicing the economic data, the annual wage data, the tax return data, I would do all my own math, and I was well known in the building for. In fact, once an editor came by my desk where I had stacks and stacks of paper from a tax shelter gone awry that I was writing about, and I had these pins up on the wall with letters A, T, R, and he comes by, and this is an editor at the New York Times who has an MBA, and he says, "Are you doing algebra?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, why are you doing algebra? This is a newspaper. And I said, because I can't figure out how this tax dodge worked, this illegal tax shelter, and keep all the facts straight unless I reduce it to algebra. And so, no, I have never spoken to anybody else and wouldn't. I mean, if they called me, I would say, in impolite language, I would tell them, to get lost.
Okay. Are you supporting a candidate in this election?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, clearly, I don't think Donald Trump is fit to be president of the United States. Anybody who reads my book can see that. But I'm not supporting anybody. And by the way, I'm a registered Republican.
Oh, okay. I won't hold that against you. Okay, now what about back to casinos? Trump's war with Steve Wynn. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that was the garden I'm sitting in, paid for the movie that was Tim Burton wanted to make about Steve Wynn and Donald Trump. Steve Wynn, who made modern Las Vegas. He built the Mirage on the Strip in 1989, and the Mirage is to casino gaming as Disneyland in 1955 was to amusement parks. A huge upgrade that completely changed the ballgame. Wynn is himself a master gambler. He has a very deep knowledge of every aspect of the casino business and of gambling and of finance. And Mr. Trump didn't know anything. When I first met him, Mr. Trump, one of the things I was struck by was that he struck me as P.T. Barnum, right, selling you the Fiji mermaid, the fakes and hoaxes that were in the P.T. Barnum Museum in the late 1800s. And I immediately began learning from Steve Wynn, from executives at other casinos, and even from Trump's own people, that Donald Trump did not know anything about the casino business. He didn't know the games. He didn't know the odds. There's a chapter in The Making of Donald Trump to illustrate exactly this point. When the biggest gambler in the world came to Atlantic City, and I watched him gamble, I'm the only journalist who did, at the rate of $14 million an hour for nearly a week. And Trump should have made a fortune off this guy, but because he mishandled it, because he didn't know what he was doing, he lost money. Millions of dollars on this guy. And that was one of the things I was so struck by. So Steve Wynn got ticked off when Trump attacks people, just as you've seen him attack, he's attacked the Speaker of the House. No president has ever gone around attacking the Speaker of the House the way Donald Trump attacks Paul Ryan, because no legislation moves in Congress unless the Speaker wants it to move. You want to be a failed president, you tick off the Speaker of the House. Presidents court the Speaker of the House, except Trump. And he went after Steve Wynn and suggested that, Steve Wynn didn't know what he was doing, which is absurd.
Well, didn't they have some kind of agreement where Trump said he was going to stay out of Vegas? But they must have made up by now, right?
Oh, I don't think they've made up by now. I actually thought about calling Steve, and I just have been so busy promoting the book, and I wrote it in such a hurry that I didn't have time to call him. But I've spent many hours with Steve Wynn one-on-one, until nearly dawn in his office, and he has no regard for Trump as a businessman. He thinks he's a dilettante, and whereas Steve Wynn is unquestionably a multi-billionaire, there's actually no evidence to support Mr. Trump's claims that he's even a billionaire.
Right. Well, what do you think?
He's a wealthy man. He's a very wealthy man. I wouldn't dispute that for a second. But you don't have to be a billionaire for the lifestyle Donald Trump has. You need an income of $20, $25, $30 million to support the lifestyle he has.
So what do you think his net worth is?
I don't know, and that's what he sued Tim O'Brien, my colleague at the New York Times, and a few times my editor, over, after spending a lot of time with Trump and looking at records Trump provided him. He estimated that his net worth was less than $200 million, which is still a tremendous amount of money.
Sure.
And Trump sued him over that. And in The Making of Donald Trump, I quote from his testimony under oath, "Well, how do you determine your net worth, Mr. Trump?" And his answer is, well, it depends on my feelings. If I'm feeling up that day, it's higher, and if I'm feeling down, it's less. And he talks about this at some length, and it's based on his emotional attitude. I don't know about you, but I figure my net worth by saying, here's the assets I own, a house and stocks and whatnot, and here's the loans I owe to banks, and the difference is my net worth. That's not how Donald does it. Mr. Trump thinks about it in terms of his emotions. That's why in June and July of last year, so a period of just days, he described his net worth as being $8.7 billion, $10 billion, more than $10 billion, and in one interview, $11 billion.
Is it a good move?
Nothing in the market or anywhere else suggested that kind of gravitation and movement.
That reminds me. Now we really couldn't tell, because when he shows us what properties he has, he doesn't say how much loans are on those properties, correct?
That's right. And tomorrow the New York Times has a big page one story where, with the help of a professional real estate firm, they have ascertained that Donald Trump has $650 million of loans against his businesses. And they quote the Trump campaign as saying that, because that's not in his presidential disclosure form, they say, well, the presidential disclosure form only asks about his personal loans. Whoa. We disclosed 240 million of them, and he has no personal loans. Well, no, all rich people do things through corporations. When I started with my oldest son, a little lodging management company, we manage a hotel and one other property. We don't own it, we manage it. We created a corporation. That's how you do these things. But it's our corporation. And it turns out that the loans that Trump owes, that they were able to identify, many of them are from Chinese banks. And there are a lot of questions raised. I've written stories in the Daily Beast. I read a column for them, an opinion column,
right,
about his involvement with Russian oligarchs. We know that Russian oligarchs have paid Donald money. We know they've been major purchasers of Trump apartments at premium prices. And there's a very curious land deal in Florida. I didn't have time to get into the book, where one of the Russian oligarchs bought a piece of property next to Mar-a-Lago for a fortune, never lived there, and appears to be turning it over to Trump for a song. Most of us might wonder if that was some kind of a payoff.
We live in scary times. David Cay Johnston, it's C-A-Y, you go Johnston, and you go to Daily Beast and look up all the work he's done on Daily Beast. This is incredible stuff. Now, one of these articles just came out just in the past couple of weeks about the $250 million tax scam. Tell us about that.
Well, Donald Trump, for a number of years, traveled around America with a man named Felix Sater, who is the son of the reputed boss of the Russian mob in New York, who is a convicted violent felon and a stock swindler. He also apparently has helped the CIA intercept missiles on their way to terrorists. And among the projects that Donald Trump and Felix Sater, who had an office in the suite of Trump Tower near Mr. Trump and had a business card, senior advisor to Mr. Trump, was something called the Trump Soho. The Trump Soho is a high-rise combination offices and apartments and apartments and hotel in Lower Manhattan. This project was recapitalized through the corrupt Icelandic banks that collapsed the economy there in deals that involved Russian oligarchs. There is a private law enforcement action, it's called a QTAM case, in state court that describes this as this and a related property tax measure as a $250 million tax fraud. Donald Trump is not a defendant in that case. Felix Sater is, and Felix Sater's company is, but he's a material witness. And he signed a document, Donald Trump signed a document that made it possible for the deal to take place that the lawsuit alleges was a tax scam. Now, Felix Sater and his company vigorously deny there was anything improper. They insist this was just a routine capitalization. But in the lawsuit are allegations that one of the executives and partners in the deal was supposed to get $7 million. He didn't get anything. When he pressed for money, he was told he could have $500,000 or he could get killed. And he's one of several people who have made allegations that Felix Sater threatened them with violence over money. Donald Trump claims that he hardly knows this guy. He told the Associated Press, I wouldn't recognize him if he were in the room. Well, I have photographs and newspaper interviews and videos of them being together in two cities in Colorado, in Phoenix, in Fort Lauderdale, and in New York City, including at the grand opening of the Trump Soho. So that's just not a plausible claim by Donald Trump. Mr. Trump knows this guy perfectly well.
Yeah, he had an office in the Trump organization, correct?
That's right. That's right. And he has since told recently, I think it was the Washington Post, but one of the major newspapers, he gave them an interview, and he hasn't been willing to talk to me. And he gave them an interview, and he said, of course I know Donald Trump. I was with him all the time. We talked all the time. We saw each other all the time. So even Felix Sater has said that Donald Trump's denials are not credible.
There's a book about this called The Scorpion and the Frog. But this guy, he's involved in a $40 million swindle. He took a margarita glass and he stabbed the guy in the face with it, right? And
that's an unrelated earlier case, but it tells you about what a violent man he is.
Yeah, and he has an office in Trump's organization, a business card, senior advisor.
Well, but this goes to something else, Ed.
Yeah.
Trump has a legal duty to the banks who loan him money and to investors when he's in a partnership to investigate the backgrounds of people. You can get hired for a job these days for anything, much above the level of a clerk, and the employer will probably pay for at least minimal background check on you. And in the case of Felix Sater, all you had to do was a Google search. Trump certainly was on notice in 2007 about Sater's background because Charlie Bagley of the New York Times, who used to be my desk mate at the Times, is the best real estate reporter in America. I mean, it's astonishing what he knows about the ins and outs of the real estate business and who's involved in New York, and knows far more than I suspect anybody, including people in the business, about everything that's going on in that business. And he wrote a piece laying out Felix Sater's background. Well, at this point, you would think that Donald Trump would sever his ties with him, but no. Just as with Joey Wexelbaum, the drug trafficker, Mr. Trump continued to maintain his ties to Felix Sater. And that goes to this lifelong pattern where Trump runs towards con artists, swindlers, the drug trafficker, Italian mafia, Russian mobsters, whenever it's profitable for him to do so.
We got about 5 minutes left, unless you can stay after the break. Can you give me some more time after the break?
I got to get off at 9. I'm sorry.
Okay.
My time, 9 o'clock.
Everyone's used to me begging the guests. Don't worry. Okay.
Yeah.
But now, what can you tell us about Trump University?
Trump University was the idea of a guy who was in the business of people who have to have continuing education credits. Lawyers, accountants, and real estate agents have to go to periodic training to make sure they're up to date on the law. And this guy brings him an idea and says, hey, look, if we call it Trump Real Estate Licensing School or whatever they want to call it, you can charge premium prices. Trump decides this is a great idea, tells the guy he's taking the idea away from him, but he'll pay him $250,000 a year and a little slice of the equity, I think 3 or 5%. Mr. Trump then does a video in which he says it's all about success. We're going to have the best faculty on real estate. Nobody will know more than our faculty, both the full-time and the adjunct faculty, and I will handpick these people. Well, under oath, it turns out he didn't pick any of these people. He didn't even know their names. He knew nothing of their backgrounds. The faculty included a guy who ran a fast food joint, 2 people in personal bankruptcy, and a lot of people whose previous work experience was in high-pressure boiler room sales tactics. You paid $1,500 for the first 3-day seminar, and you were told that if you got the full package for $35,000, you got a better education than the finest business schools. Trump personally said that in the video. These, you said, well, I don't have the money. They would stand there and tell you how to call banks and get credit card loans so that you could pay the $35,000. And many of these people exhausted their ability to borrow money doing this. Of course, if you've exhausted your ability to borrow money to pay Trump University, how could you go into the real estate business? You have no capacity to take out mortgages. You were also promised that you would meet Donald Trump. What you actually got was the opportunity to have your picture taken with a life-size cutout of Donald Trump. You were told you were going to get Donald Trump's secrets about borrowing money. What you got was a list of lenders that I found on the Internet for free. It was a complete fraud, and the state of Texas sent investigators to 57 different sales pitches. They recommended suing Trump and suing him personally, and did a legal analysis that he had no legal defenses for what he had done. And the Attorney General of Texas, now the Governor, Greg Abbott, declined to take action and did nothing. In Florida, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, said she was thinking about joining the New York State Attorney General's fraud suit. Donald, through his charitable foundation, then made a charitable gift to the Pam Bondi election campaign and tried to cover it up by indicating it went to 2 other organizations, neither with similar names, neither of which ever got a dime from them. It is against the law for a charitable foundation to make a gift to a campaign. And yet Pam Bondi's campaign manager publicly said, we're perfectly comfortable with this gift from the Donald J. Trump Charitable Foundation. There are 2 lawsuits going on in San Diego, class action lawsuits. And you remember Donald Trump some weeks ago attacked the judge. He said he's a Mexican, he's a hater of Trump, he's biased against him. What most of the news reports didn't tell people was that the day that Donald Trump made these scurrilous claims was the same day that the judge concluded that his testimony under oath should be made public. The Washington Post and a bunch of other news organizations had filed a court action asking that these be unsealed. And the judge withheld the video, but he agreed to release the transcripts. And that's what launched Trump into his attack on the integrity of this judge, a former prosecutor who has a sterling reputation.
Yeah, and we have those transcripts up on OppermanReport.com. Okay. You could find them. I read them all myself, too, as well. What do you think? Do you think he's going to win the suit or lose?
The lawsuit? I can't imagine any way in which he can possibly win this case. It is a huge problem for him. It will not be resolved, however, till after the election. But between the 2 cases in California and the New York State Attorney General and his own testimony that people can read, as you said, at your website, or they can read about in the Making of Donald Trump, they will see that he essentially has no defenses. This is what's called a bait-and-switch fraud, and I don't see how he can possibly wiggle out of this.
David Cay Johnston, you are my hero. You can find him at the Daily Beast. I'm telling you, man, I love all your work. I really do. The Making of Donald Trump, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.